All right. Thanks for joining. Glad everybody could make it. Okay. So, just some of the guidelines for today, some things we want to get through. We're going to try to sketch out the argument here in a moderate amount of detail. It's a pretty complicated argument in some respects. Um, because that's part of the dialectical nature of it. It's sometimes very hard to say with uh, certainty, or even it's hard to locate a sort of solid assertion that is made because every assertion is always subject to dialectical revision, which means that you're always trying to examine truth from the point of view of sort of developing conflictual relationship between opposites. And so that often means that um, you might want to pigeonhole them into asserting a certain thing. And often the temptation is because they critique one thing, and then you might immediately assume, oh, so then they must affirm the opposite. But what you'll find is they usually don't affirm the opposite either. What they affirm is the continual negation, a sort of productive or progressive negation of one idea, um, negating itself and becoming a new idea or a alternative idea. But within that alternative idea, there's a sort of internal conflict, a sort of self-undermining, self-undermined, a sort of self-negating property. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, maybe when we look at specific examples of that in the chapter. Actually, a kind of good thing to read um, after this chapter, or maybe it's even good to start with it, even though it's at the very end of the book. They put it as the last sort of appendix of the book. But there's a section called, I think it's called Notes and Sketches or something like that. Yeah, Notes and Sketches starts on page 173. And that's actually, in some respects, a little bit easier to read. For one thing, it's just a bunch of short aphorisms. Um, and there's one aphorism, let's see if I can find it really quickly. I was just reading through these last night, um, where there's a sort of dialogue where you can imagine either Horkheimer or Adorno sort of talking to their father, explaining their choice to become a philosopher. The reason I say that is that both of them had fathers that were bourgeois merchants. Adorno's father was a wine merchant, and Horkheimer's father, I don't remember what the trade was, but he was like an entrepreneur in industry. I didn't realize this, but he came from an area that I know well around Stuttgart, which is now where the Mercedes and the Porsche headquarters are, the Porsche and Mercedes. So, it's like big. Stuttgart is sort of like a more successful version of Detroit, maybe, but there's a big manufacturing center there. And that's, by the way, why Stuttgart is a completely modern city, because it was bombed to smithereens in the Second World War, because that's where all the factories were. And that's where Horkheimer comes from, right? So I think that's maybe kind of an interesting psychoanalytic historical thing to consider. But right on page 197, there's an aphorism called contradictions. And it puts an anecdotal form and in a sort of dialogue format. Um, it sort of it gives you an example of the dialectical method where, as I said, the negation or the critique of one idea does not automatically mean that you affirm the opposite. Last time Archie and I talked a little bit about the semantics of dialectical logic. Semantics just means, how do logical operators behave with respect to the truth or respect to equivalency? And one thing about dialectical logic is that a double negation is not the same thing as an affirmation, right? So you have A, you have non-A, and with the law of excluded middle in classical logic, if you negate non-A, you just end up back at A. But in dialectical logic, the negation of the negation is a sublated affirmation, right? So there's not a strict bijection with respect to negation where, the negation of one truth value just puts you back at the opposite truth value so that, a bijective function there would be like not false means true and not true means false, and there's no other alternative. In dialectical logic, not false gives you a sort of new partial truth that is not where you started. It's also not the complete truth. It's sort of this process of, sublation is the word that Hegel uses for it. In German, it's Aufhebung. Aufhebung is a strange, sort of paradoxical word in German because it has a variety of meanings, some of which conflict with each other. So, Aufhebung, Aufheben can mean like to cancel something. Like if you lift a restriction, you can say you hebe es auf. Yeah, it's aufgehoben. But it can also mean to lift up. So like um, there's a sense that it's both a canceling but an elevation, and that's what sublation is. That's what we are translating with the word sublation. And so, the way that truth behaves in dialectical logic is that negation always gives you a partial truth, but it never just puts you back where you started, right? Okay. Just so like if you remember from, if you watch the video, um, Justin, we do that all the time in ordinary language, right? So like if I say, you ask me, do you like my shirt? And I say, it's not ugly. It doesn't mean that it's beautiful or good or whatever. And it's really interesting with the way we say that in ordinary language, at least in English, and we do this in German too, that part of the meaning and part of the indication that I'm not dealing with a bivalent, true false logic is the tone of voice, right? The fact that I say it's not ugly instead of it's not ugly, right? Isn't that interesting? So that, this maybe also gives you a little bit of insight into the fairly capacious understanding of truth that they're dealing with here. If tone of voice has semantic content, right? If tone of voice influences the truth value of a proposition, then we're dealing with a different sort of logic than you find, say, from, Aristotle's formal logic or in logical positivism or this sort of thing, right? That tone of voice has a truth functionality to it, but it's not the same sort of truth functionality that, Russell or the positivists or whatever would consider um, valid or descriptive of what we mean when we say truth. Um, yeah. By the way, Arshia, that's a fairly typical conceit in Romanticism, and you might remember from the Ives class we talked about Hawthorne in this way, because Hawthorne does this all the time in his language, right? It's basically like a kind of dialectical way of writing that he's always negating, but he's doing it in a way that he's saying something and also not saying it at the same time. Um, and so, that's something that's quite descriptive here. And it's one of the things that makes it fairly hard to really sketch out what the argument is, because it's not going to proceed by, premises to a conclusion. The conclusion then is a new premise, and then another syllogism and a syllogism and so on. And it's a chain of inferential argument. It works a little bit like that, but there's a chain. It's just not that, um, it's not quite that, I suppose, clear in the way that it's built up in terms of assertions and propositions. Okay. I'm not sure if there's anything else I want to say. Oh, well, I did want to say one thing about the style of writing here, which I guess I didn't really say much about last time, but you get a very strong sense of it just by reading the first chapter. I would say that actually, this chapter, probably because it's co-authored, and probably because it's not, even though they talk about art and aesthetics quite a lot, it's not strictly an aesthetic text. The quality that I'm about to describe is not as strong as you might find it in other works by Adorno, say Minima Moralia or uh, his aesthetic writings and so on. But one thing that makes it a little hard to follow what's going on is that it's not syntactic in the sense of an inferential argument where there's a chain of premises that yield conclusions and so on. Very often, this style is referred to as being paratactic. Paratactic. So we talked, this is another thing that we talked about in the Ives class, right? Parataxis as opposed to, say, syntaxis or, um, an argument that proceeds by an unbroken chain of inference. This is more something where we throw together a bunch of ideas and see what comes out in the gaps between things that aren't strictly or obviously related in, say, an inferential way. And I think that that kind of explains how wide-ranging this argument is. I mean, it's anything but the sort of writing that you would find, say, in analytic philosophy, where there's a really restricted scope to the argument. You're usually, you might, in a typical analytic essay, you would probably just be talking about a specific syntactical function and its logical structure or something, and that would be it. Whereas here, it's like the entire world is sort of thrown together in this huge constellation of ideas that all sort of point to an organizing phenomenon or an organizing structure, which is, um, the it's sort of reason run amok is the sort of thing that all these examples are pointing to. But it's really an argument by accumulation. That is to say, just lots and lots and lots of examples, and I hesitate to use the word example because uh, there's a very specific way that they're interpreting uh, the things that they're using as examples. And in fact, a lot of the quote unquote examples are sort of, as I said before, sort of clarifying fictions where they're talking about like shamans and, the history of magic, and they're talking about myths containing the seeds of enlightenment, which from a historical point of view should sort of be a non-starter because they're trying to say that there is a fact that connects really different styles of writing and different social formations over, 3 millennia or whatever, you know, um, which is to say that interpretation is really the name of the game here. They're examples, but they're not meant to be points of evidence like you would have, say, in a scientific explanation. They're representations of a phenomenon. But to get to the representation requires a lot of sort of interpretation, maybe sort of almost psychoanalysis or this sort of thing. Okay. You want to respond to any of that before we jump in and try to sketch out the argument?
I don't have much to say, but just to confirm, one by the paratactical style, you mean it's just when there are different fragments just put next to each other, right? And then you get this.
Basically, yeah. And as I
Mm,
said, it's not as strong here as in other writings. You maybe get a stronger sense of this if you go to that section on notes and sketches where it's really just a bunch of aphorisms.
mm,
Um, but Parataxis is a style of writing where it's a sort of negative argument, and what I mean by that is that um, it attempts to persuade by forcing the reader to fill in the gaps and kind of figure out what connects these ideas, right? And so it's arguing by virtue of the gaps between things that seem related, but not in a strict inferential way, right?
Hmm.
And from that point of view, it shares a lot with certain approaches to art. One thing that I've talked about a lot, let's say with respect to musique concrète or something, right, is that musique concrète is interesting because it can connect ideas, concepts, objects, and so on in a way that is not about, causal relationships or conceptual relationships. It's the pure aesthetic similarity very often between, say, sounds that may indicate objects that are totally unrelated. But in bringing together objects that are unrelated, there seems to be a proclivity of the human mind that we always want to find connections, regardless of how remote the things are from each other. And so, to the extent that you can suggest a point of view or suggest an argument through the gaps between otherwise unrelated things or only weakly related things, it's a sort of uh, it's a way to argue negatively, right? You're arguing by what is left unsaid in the gaps between these things, right? As I said, this chapter, I think there is kind of a line of argument that you can follow, you can piece together. And the paratactic style is really only sort of there in the fact that it's like all these seemingly unrelated things that are thrown together to make the argument. So what I mean by that is, um, you have the scientific revolution of the 17th century. You have, uh, non-Western shamanic magical practices. You have the myths of Homer. You have um, Jewish ritual. You have, you know, uh, to some extent, the history of early 20th century physics. All this stuff, right? It's like, you know, there's a kind of collage aspect to it, and that the collage aspect you could describe literally as being paratactic, right? Even so, I think that they are sort of tied together through a line of argument that we can kind of sketch out. And so that's what we're going to try to do. Okay, so um, we did a little bit of that last time. I guess I would maybe start by asking, what is the dialectic of enlightenment? What is it about enlightenment that is perhaps self-undermining or self-negating or self-conflicting? What is it in particular? Uh-oh, I don't like these silences. Oh no.
It's pretty hard. I don't know if I can answer to an extent that would be satisfactory to that question, but I think there is there isn't. I guess the only thing that I can kind of think of
Okay,
is like, yeah,
let's make it easy. Okay.
okay, yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's just like I don't want to like spend 3 hours, and so let's read the first sentence. Let's read the first sentence. In fact, maybe the first two sentences I think is better because
mm,
here's where we get the nice. It's the first sort of dialectical move um, in the book. The first two sentences. All right. Which again is sort of there's a sense in which this undermines the account of this chapter as being paratactic. There is a thesis statement, and it's right at the beginning.
mm.
Okay, so read it. How about Justin? You read the first sentence, and Narcio, you read the second sentence.
Enlightenment, understood in the widest sense as the advance of thought, has always aimed at liberating human beings from fear and installing them as masters.
Okay, that's what you're going to argue for. And Arshia, you're going to argue for the second sentence.
Yet the holy enlightened earth is radiant with triumphant calamity.
Calamity. You know what,
Calamity. Oh,
you know
okay.
what calamity is?
No, actually.
Oh, calamity is disaster.
Oh, like this distress and disaster.
Now, calamity
I see.
is like
I
as
see.
bad as it gets. It's like triumphant calamity.
Ah, okay, okay.
Already just in that construction, triumphant calamity, there's a sort of irony, right?
Mm.
That calamity is anything but a triumph. Okay, this is interesting. There are two assertions here, and they seem to be opposed. The first assertion is that enlightenment is about liberation. The second argument is that liberation has somehow led to disaster. Okay, try to put this together because you can infer from this what the dialectic of enlightenment is. I mean, already we have right here a dialectical move. Enlightenment means liberation, means giving you power, means setting you free. Somehow setting us free means that we're destroying ourselves. Okay, now they haven't told you why yet, but that's a question I could ask you. How can the particular sort of liberation that enlightenment promises lead to disaster?
Um, the well, my understanding of this is that enlightenment, understood as knowledge, dispels myths. It gives us a rational understanding of the world, but it also causes us to subjugate nature, and it also causes us to subjugate power relationships.
Yeah, okay, good. So, how does enlightenment liberate? How does it liberate? Let's make the language as simple as possible. How does it liberate?
It provides us with knowledge.
That doesn't tell me how it liberates. What do we need liberation from?
Fear.
Fear. Fear of what?
Would it be the fear of the unknown?
Yeah, maybe. But why should we fear the unknown? Let's think really, really, really unpoetically, really,
Mm.
really materialistically. What are people afraid of?
Not having things.
Yeah, that's not a big fear. What's the biggest fear?
Death.
Yeah,
Death.
death, pain, suffering, sickness. That's what we need liberation from. And that's what enlightenment promises. Why are we subject to those things? Because nature is a force before enlightenment that we can't dominate. Nature dominates us, and it's enlightenment that liberates us, but it liberates us precisely through domination. Well, that's the dialectic. You want freedom, but freedom means domination on the enlightenment scheme. Now, there's an extra move here, which you already alluded to, Justin, which is that part of the way that enlightenment dominates nature is by getting rid of superstition. And there are a lot of superstitions, including, for instance, the idea that human beings are separate from nature, that the human soul is somehow, reaches beyond nature or something like that. Enlightenment shuts that all down. Enlightenment says, well, okay, if you want to dominate nature, you need to first understand that nature is not supernatural. There is no supernatural. All there is nature. And human beings are also in nature. So if we're dominating nature, we're also dominating human beings, right? That's where the problem comes from, according to them. The dialectic of enlightenment is the desire for freedom from fear, but at the cost of self-domination. right? Okay. That's the thesis, and it's right there in the first two sentences. Now, we would maybe want to, and the third sentence kind of wraps that up. Enlightenment's program was the disenchantment of the world, getting rid of superstition, right? Okay, so then we might want to think, what do they mean by saying that the earth is radiant with triumphant calamity, remembering that this was written in exile in 1941, right? What is the calamity?
The calamity is if we have advanced so far in terms of knowledge and reason, why do atrocities still happen?
Yeah, and not only this or that atrocity, but in history at that point, the largest, most systematized atrocity ever. Right. Of course, this is still before, the full horrors of the Holocaust and everything were apparent, but it was pretty clear that things were going in a bad direction. That should not be possible, right? It's sort of strange that Enlightenment understood um, as, the elevation of humanity should lead to humanity destroying itself, right? And here again, Archie and I talked a little bit about what happens to the understanding of reason, such that it makes inhumanity possible. If reason is supposed to be a humanizing, undertaking, right? We talk about the humanities, or we talk about, the capacity of education and reasoned discourse to elevate those better angels of our nature, right? To elevate the potential for humane activity, right? How is it possible that enlightenment then leads to inhumanity? And it has to do with a certain sort of impoverished idea of reason, which we talked about at length last time, but let's just kind of recap that.
What do you mean impoverished idea of reason?
Okay. Um, let's see if you can remember what we talked about for an hour last time.
Okay. Sorry, I'm a little brain fogged. I have a very bad fever.
Oh, you
Let me
do? Are
see.
you sick?
Yeah, yeah. I
Good.
apologize.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I'll be more compassionate then.
Oh.
Okay. Okay. I guess maybe one thing to keep in mind is that it's probably important to distinguish enlightenment from reason, right? That reason is a more capacious concept than enlightenment. Enlightenment is like a species of reason, or it's a particular relationship or understanding of reason, right? Reason understood as a capacity of human thought has a long history um, that connects it to ethics, right? That connects it to the good life, that connects it to the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of goodness, etc., right? That is something that, at least, through Kant, has always seemed to require this notion of a transcendent world or transcendence of some sort. Now, Kant is very careful to, um, he doesn't allow himself to be pigeonholed as um, he's certainly not a Platonist in the strong sense, believing that what is true or what is real is just the world of forms or something like that. He's in this weird sort of place where, you know, um, he at least thinks that the notion of a transcendent world is something that is very important to us and probably required for ethics, even if it doesn't really exist, it's still required as a moral postulate. maybe it's easier to just start with Plato, right? And Plato's understanding of the way that reason connects us to goodness, right? How does reason connect us to goodness in Plato, and what does it have to do with two worlds?
Plato is thinking of virtues, um, and he believes that in order to be uh, uh, like virtuous, you have to try to uh, kind of reason your way through it. If I remember, that was a very bad recap, but that's kind of
Well, you
like
didn't answer the second part of the question. What does it have to do with two worlds?
oh that like the good or like the idea of virtue or whatever is it exists in the realm of the forms. So it's
Yeah,
not
yeah. So,
it's like in a different
there's all this talk about the idea that the world as we live in it, as we see it or encounter it in experience, is somehow lesser, right? Somehow fallen or deficient or something, right? And that our souls have access to a different sort of world wherein we have this sort of memory or this inherent, innate knowledge or recollection of perfection, right?
Mhm.
If the world as we live in it were all that existed, it doesn't seem like we should have this idea of perfection. For one thing, you just take the stupid example of like the triangle, right? Okay, it's like you never see a perfect triangle, right? We can use reason to define what must be the case for a thing to count as a triangle, and yet we never actually encounter that in our experience. So then that seems to suggest that if we never encounter it in our experience, and yet nonetheless we have that as an idea, then there must be a dimension or a world or some other sort of ontological space where the idea of perfection comes from, because it doesn't come from this world, it doesn't come from what we see, what we actually encounter, right? And so, that's where this idea of another world comes from, a world that is transcendent, right? It's outside of the world that we actually live in, the world of appearances, right? And that's the world where we, that's the world that we attribute certain ideas like perfection to, right? Among the various perfections might be perfect goodness, right? In fact, actually, he has this account of how the form of the good is actually the form of all forms.
Mhm.
And so it's like the most perfect form is the form of the good. I won't give that argument, but it probably isn't too hard to kind of figure that out. Well, how do we have access to the form of the good? Through reason. But in particular, the way that reason connects us to a world that is transcendent from this world. Okay. And even with Kant, Kant is an Enlightenment figure, but you have the noumenal realm, which is to say the space of reasons, as opposed to the space of, say, causality, the space of nature, right? And to the extent that we're able to be ethical in this world, it's because we can appeal to a space that is independent of causality, right? Now, whether or not that actually exists is not something that Kant is committed to, except that he thinks that heuristically, if you want ethics to actually be a standard for action in this world, you'd better believe in uh, certain theoretical entities like God, like the happiness of heaven, the soul, freedom of the will, etc. But none of those are things you know. You can only have faith in them. The reason you might want to you can have good reasons for believing in them because you want morality to be real, but you can't have knowledge in the way that you can have knowledge of the objects of the physical world, right? So there's still this sort of sense of transcendence in Kant's morality. Enlightenment shuts that all down. Enlightenment says no. Um, we can give a much simpler and probably more powerful account in which we totally get rid of transcendence. All that exists is this world. If all that exists is this world, then at least traditionally, the traditional understanding of ethics seems like it falls out the window, right? Because you can construe ethics as a kind of efficient way for people to survive because they need to form communities. They need to divide labor so that they can, you know, more efficiently um, achieve self-preservation. That's a term they use a lot in this chapter, self-preservation as the purpose of reason. But the problem is that self-preservation, it's not so clear what the relationship between self-preservation and goodness is in this very sort of sense of perfect goodness. Because the thing is that if we're really just interested in self-preservation, but not some sort of transcendent goodness, then there are all sorts of things that are obviously in our self-interest that on the traditional account would be unethical. Like, for instance, completely eradicating our enemies or something, you know, or whatever, enslaving everybody except you or your closest comrades or whatever. That, if all you're interested in self-preservation, then it's not really clear how you defend against the use of reason to establish what's good for you, but maybe not what is universally good, right? Um, so that's one part of it. In shutting down this notion of transcendence, and in particular, the role of transcendence in the pursuit of the good, Enlightenment's understanding of reason moves away from reason as a pathway to goodness and sees it as simply a tool for the preservation of a certain species called Homo sapiens that has evolved in such a way that it is able to manipulate its environment for its own self-preservation. Right? That's what Enlightenment's version of reason is. Okay. And last time I made the claim that I don't think that Horkheimer and Adorno believe in transcendence or, the absolute good because they're materialists. They come out of a Marxian tradition, although, you know, um, I know Horkheimer wrote his dissertation on Kant's third critique, and I know that Adorno was highly influenced by Kant and Hegel. And so, there is still an element of a desire for um, mm, well, either transcendence. I mean, with Hegel was an eminent philosopher too, but he was not a materialist. So there's this maybe sense of longing for an alternative to materialism or a sense of longing for a transcendent good, but we shouldn't take that as an inscription of a belief in those things, right? And so last time I said that, it's just something that reason makes us desire, long for, hope for, but can never actually deliver on. Okay, so kind of to sum up that, I'll just say in two sentences what I said over the last 15 minutes. Okay, so enlightenment in shutting down transcendence and saying all that exists is the material world then adopts a certain kind of more deficient understanding of reason that just sees it as a evolutionary adaptation, a tool. But that means that it shuts down certain questions like ethics, like goodness in itself, and so on. Okay, what was your question?
Well, so one, just about what you just said. So it's impoverished reason in respect to what reason was before Enlightenment, right?
Yeah, when I say impoverished, I really just mean that it's not as powerful
Mm-mm.
because it can't connect us to the good, right? So one way to think about this maybe, Kant talks in some places about the um, the difference between reason and logic, right? Um, so he says in many places that the nature of reason is that it reaches for a maximum. It's always moving towards a maximum. But you can think of logic as not reaching for a maximum, but simply as reaching towards consistency, right? That what logic is interested in is just making sure that, premises and their conclusions are consistent, but not necessarily that it reaches for a maximum, right? And so you can see that perhaps as one way of describing the impoverishment of reason in enlightenment, that reason just becomes logic and not a pathway to metaphysical goodness, right? Because it's not any longer about reaching for maximum. It's simply a tool to um, to dispel inconsistent arguments, right? That's all it is. I mean, if you look at Wittgenstein, for instance, Wittgenstein and logical positivists talk this way too, uh, that they talk about the end of philosophy, and the end of philosophy, one kind of shorthand slogan for what Wittgenstein is interested in, at least in the Tractatus, is to see philosophy as nothing more than a switchboard for the sciences. And what that means is that philosophy, understood simply as logic, understood simply as a tool for getting rid of inconsistent arguments, the only thing it can do is ask the question, is this question um, the sort of question to which I could give a consistent argument or a consistent answer? And what that means is that, can I give a scientific account? Is it the sort of thing that I can investigate scientifically through the consistency of empirical science? That's all philosophy is for them, right? It doesn't connect us to some large notion of the true or the good. All it does is get rid of the things that are not properly scientific, right? Which is to say, are not consistent. Um, so, that's the version of philosophy that they're talking about in Enlightenment. And to a certain extent, Enlightenment here really does mean positivism in the early 20th century, right? This particular version of Enlightenment. Because even with Kant, or, well, certainly not with Hume, but with Kant and, you know, Hegel and even Marx, there's always this understanding that philosophy's purpose is making the world good, making the lives of people good and so on in a um, way that is more than just simple material self-preservation, you know. But with Hume, the logical positivists, they took a certain amount from Kant. What they took from Kant was the critical component where, you know, he talks about what cannot count as an object of knowledge. So in other words, anything that can't be an object of experience cannot be an object of knowledge. That's from the first critique, and that's something that the positives take on board. But they seem largely to be motivated by Hume and his skepticism, right? That there's a strong sense that logical positivism is, at least in a really major way, a skeptical project, right? It's in particular, just historically, it's also a reaction to Anglophone Hegelianism, that was really um, prestigious and influential in the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century. And what the positivists really want to do is simply eliminate metaphysics, right? To quote A.J. Ayer. But that's a skeptical project. It's not really a constructive project. All it's telling us is um, that a lot of things that we thought were meaningful are actually just nonsense, right? Okay, so Yeah, so that's one really major thing here. Enlightenment liberates through domination. One upshot of that is that it shuts down the transcendent world. All that exists is the immanent world, the material world. And so the version of reason that can survive that is instrumental reason and nothing else. Okay. Now, they have a problem because they're also materialists. They also are, immanentists. They believe that there's nothing outside the world. All that exists is the world, and that means nature. They have this maybe longing or this sense that reason promises things, but not that they actually believe in it, just that it's part of the human psychological condition to desire a maximum of goodness or whatever. But their problem is that enlightenment, in sort of establishing itself as the only game in town, makes critique seemingly impossible because if you try to critique enlightenment, you have to do it in a way that is on enlightenment's terms, right? There is no knowledge outside of the sort of knowledge that is sanctioned by enlightenment, right? So how do they do it? What's their response? How can you get at a critique from inside enlightenment? One reason why you might think that's a little bit difficult is, maybe I'll try to make it kind of anecdotal, although it's actually a logical fallacy. If you're interested in names, it might be like the tu quoque fallacy. You know what that is?
Mm.
Tu quoque just means you too.
Oh,
And so if it's like, I'm an alcoholic and I seem, or actually there used to, you guys are too young for this, but in the 90s, there used to be a PSA advertisement where there was a kid like listening on a Walkman. All right, this already dates me horribly, but he's listening to music on a Walkman and he's like air drumming and his dad walks in with a bag of marijuana. He's like, I just found this. Who taught you how to do this? Who taught you how to do this? And the kid says, You, Dad. I learned it by watching you. Um, okay, so the fallacy there is tu quoque. The dad's right. There's probably, okay, well, let's just assume that marijuana is bad. Okay. The dad's probably right that marijuana is bad. The fact that he uses marijuana does not discount that argument. But the kid says, You're wrong, Dad, because you do it too. Well, that's a fallacy, right? That's called the U2 fallacy, tu quoque. Um, from a certain point of view, the problem that they have, it might be a tu quoque fallacy too, which is that if you want to critique enlightenment, but you yourself can't escape the system of enlightenment, how can you critique it, right? It's sort of like saying, it's like, and actually they talk about this in that little aphorism called contradictions. Where it's like, okay, so you think self-preservation is bad? So would you rather that like disease just be rampant and there be no doctors and we just live like cavemen? Well, no, no, I don't. It's just that I can still critique, say, modern medical science as an arm of capitalism. Even though I need it, I use it, I want it. I can still sort of see that there's some things that are bad, but the problem is that it's very hard to escape the problem when you can only express yourself in the terms that the problem makes available to you. It's hard to critique enlightenment in when the only way that you can critique it, which is to say reasoned argument, is itself part of the problem, right? Um, and so they need to find. So you would say, okay, so maybe one way that you might critique something is if you're really totally outside of it, right? Like if the dad really never did use marijuana, then maybe he'd be in a better position to critique the kid because he's not a hypocrite. The only problem is that if you are a materialist and you believe that the immanent world is all that there is, then there is no outside. how do you get out? Well, there is no outside. In fact, one of the things that they talk about is how the outside for enlightenment is its greatest fear, and that is what explains the dispelling of metaphysics and so on. But you have to remember that they are themselves materialists, and they don't really believe in a metaphysical realm, right? Metaphysical entities don't have ontological status. Um, they might be an idea or the object of desire or something like that, but they're not real in the normal way we use that word. Um, so then how do you critique something to which there is no outside?
Is this not where that dialectical argument comes back in? Like, for instance, the opposite of materialist enlightenment is not no materialism, but there's something image like we can use those terms to kind of find some middle truth value.
Yeah, so that's really what their project is. I mean, it's a little complicated because the solution that they suggest is actually external to what they're doing themselves. They aren't actually following their own advice or their own solution because they're stuck in a particular mode of activity that is all about, enlightenment argumentation, reasoned argumentation. Um, Here's one reason why, what you're describing might be a bit problematic. There are a couple different ways to look at it. Let's first bracket the idea of dialectical logic and just talk about, the normal sort of bivalent logic, true, false, that reaches for a maximum universality, right? Um, there is a strong sense that if you are really committed to a rational argument, that you're committed to the idea of something being universally true. That is to say, um, you can just look at it from the self-undermining nature of the following sentence. There's no such thing as absolute truth. Hmm. Well, if you're really committed to that, then you believe in at least one absolute truth, that there is no such thing as absolute truth, right? Um, and so it's not really clear how you can use reason to get outside of the hegemony of universality. And it's important to understand that um, one of the one of the oppressive aspects of reason is not just that it shuts down the transcendent search for the good, because it still keeps this idea of universality, even though it's no longer the universal good that it's after. It's the only sort of universality that instrumental reason has access to, which would be what? What is the universal condition or the sort of universality that instrumental reason could appeal to? Instrumental reason really just meaning a kind of practical heuristic logic that gives you what you want in the most effective and efficient way possible. And I will distinguish effective and efficient because they're not synonyms. Something could be efficient if it helps you establish whatever you want, something that you want, with the least amount of labor possible. That would be efficient. Effective, however, is asking what is the maximum thing that I can achieve, right? So, to say that, um, oh, I don't know, okay, so like I could give you an efficient argument here within this Zoom call. I'm not doing it very well, but let's say that I really prepared and I really had like the bullet points laid out. I could give you an efficient argument so that you understand this, but it might not be as effective as a version of that argument that I spread out all through social media so that everybody hears it, right? That would be more effective, could also be efficient, right? But these things aren't the same thing. Effectiveness means sort of like maximum um, goal or, maximizing the goal, whereas efficiency means maximizing the means to that goal, right? Okay. But what I was saying is that, okay, so reason, according to Kant, reaches for a maximum, but we no longer in Enlightenment have the sort of maximum that, say, Kant or Plato or whoever was interested in, which is absolute happiness, the absolute good, you know, uh, perfect morality, this kind of thing, because all we have is this world, and logic, then reason becomes a tool for survival. But it still reaches for a maximum. It's just not the maximum good. What is it?
It's the maximum of whatever particular that the reason is after.
Yeah, yeah. What would that look like?
I,
What
I
sort
was
of
gonna say capital, just like
capital? Yeah, that would be an example. Okay. One way to think about it is so Kant, in talking about morality, often refers to um, it's sort of like a sort of a thought experiment maybe, but he talks about what what the maximum for morality would be, what's the maximum that it reaches for, and he describes it as the kingdom of ends. The kingdom of ends means a world in which everyone is treated as an end in themselves, essentially, right? Um, so that there is a social picture that's available as the sort of thing that Kantian morality, as a function of reason, is reaching for, which is to say a perfectly just world where everyone is taken care of and everyone has the capacity to um, fulfill their talents to, make themselves the best they are, but also be taken care of by each other and so on, blah, blah, blah. That's the kingdom of ends. What sort of kingdom does instrumental rationality reach for?
the means, not the
Yeah, it would be
ends.
the kingdom of means, right? Where all the means are maximized, right? But the thing is that even if I'm talking about effectiveness versus efficiency, there's always the question about whether, maximum distribution of an idea is good. That's not even part of the question. It's just that, well, if I maximize my thing by having a really powerful podcast, but what I'm spreading is misinformation, but it makes me more powerful and rich and gets my friends elected and whatever, and I'm better off and the world burns while I'm living a nice, comfortable life. Um, that would be certainly effective, but there's a big question about whether it would be good, right? So the point being that the kingdom of means or the kingdom of instrumentality would be a world in which everything is made as efficient and sort of as quantified and rationalized as possible, but without the sense that it's meaningful from the point of view of human dignity, right? Um, yeah, so, that's the sort of world that universality, instrumental universality accomplishes, right? Where everybody's just a cog in the same machine. That's what universality means on the instrumental account,
Hmm.
right?
And that's where it becomes totalitarian, right?
Yeah. Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So, but the problem is that if you're stuck in that system, and the only tool you have is rational argument, which means appeals to universality, but not the universal good because Enlightenment has shut that down. There's sort of a sense that, either what you're really arguing for is the thing you think you're arguing against, or there's another problem that can happen where just because you're arguing with the tools that the system makes available to you, the system can always absorb the critique so that you can never actually get rid of it. And this idea of absorption is, they don't talk about it here, but later on they do in other places. But that word absorption comes from the Situationists, which was a group of French intellectuals in the 60s that were heavily influenced by critical theory and I think probably Michel Foucault, although I'm not sure exactly what the relationship was with Michel Foucault, but the same sort of social critique. And what they say is that it seems that everything that we try to do to leverage a critique against capitalism, for instance, as an expression of enlightenment, capitalism is always able to absorb it and just go on as if nothing ever happened, right? And so, my favorite example of this was I remember I was preparing a lecture on Adorno for a class a few years ago, and while I was doing it, I was Googling all this stuff. And then while I was Googling it, I started getting maybe it was on Amazon or maybe it was like the Google ads or whatever were like trying to sell me paperback editions of the Dialectic of Enlightenment. And it's like it's a big question whether or not critique from inside the system can ever actually displace the system because the system can always just turn it into one more commodity, right? So what they have to do is find something, some place inside the system that doesn't abide by the same rules as reason, as enlightenment. And it's going to be the other to enlightenment, but not outside enlightenment. It's got to be something that's inside the world as we encounter it, the world as enlightened society makes available to us, but that nonetheless is somehow still outside of it. So it's like an immanent outside. Um, Here's one thing that I'd like to say about this, because we encountered this idea again in that Ives class in Henry David Thoreau's essay, Resistance to Civil Government. I don't know if you remember that essay very well. I just like it
Hardly.
because first of all, it's 100 years before Horkheimer and Adorno, and it's also American. And so it's just like, we often think about these sorts of social critiques as, a particularly maybe continental uh, 20th century phenomenon. But in fact, it's an idea that has some historical pedigree. Um, and a really kind of poetic expression of it is found in that essay, Resistance to Civil Government. Here's the following thing that Thoreau says, because he's encountering exactly the same problem. He's talking in particular about the fugitive slave law and the idea that if you want to be a member of society and sort of, whatever, like be a lawyer who fights against the injustice of your society, you have to follow the laws of the society. Among other things, you have to pay taxes, but it turns out those taxes are going to support slavery, even if you live in the North. He makes the following claim: the only just place for a man or a person, I guess, in an unjust world is a prison cell. And if you remember, he goes to the prison cell because he refuses to pay the tax to support slavery, right? But what he's saying is that the prison cell, now this is sort of a metonym or, a metaphor, a poetic device, but the prison cell is both inside society and yet outside it. It's clearly inside because it's a place in society that you put those that don't fit the system. They're left outside society for whatever reason. Now, it's not outside in the sense of a transcendent world of forms or something like that, but it is a place from which you can critique the society even though you're still nominally part of it. You're not part of it in the sense of having many rights, but if those rights are the rights that are afforded by injustice, then you probably don't want to have those rights, right? So, you see the same idea there that in order to critique an unjust system, you have to find a place within the system that is still at some level outside it. And that's essentially what they're doing, what Horkheimer and Adorno are doing in this essay as well. They're trying to find a place within society that doesn't abide by the same rules, and for that reason is not subject to the same restrictions that the Enlightenment system enforces. So how does that work? What is their site of, their site of resistance within society from which they can Now, they can't themselves launch an attack because what they're doing is not an example of the thing that they say can actually be the imminent outside. But they name an imminent outside that does destabilize the domination of enlightenment.
Is
What
it myth?
myth? Not really, because in this essay, they want to show that there is a kind of inconsistency or hypocrisy where enlightenment thinks it's dispelling myths, but enlightenment is itself a myth. And they also say that myth always contained the seeds of domination, of power, and so on. So therefore, myth was also a sort of incipient form of enlightenment. We could spend a minute on just clarifying what it means to say that enlightenment is its own myth. What does that mean?
Um, it starts to have the same sort of like quasi-religious nature
Yeah.
that myth
Where?
does.
Well, just go on X and look at the prayers and worshipful affirmations that people write to the god Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Just to get like an immediate example of this thing. But it's this belief that all of our problems will be solved through technology, that technology is going to save us, essentially. I mean, it is a salvation narrative
Hmm.
that moves out of the realm of myth or religion and takes on a technological form, but it's still the same salvation myth, right? And so, like in I think it's aphorism 125 from the gay science Nietzsche, that's the one with the madman running around talking about the death of God. If you remember, that's such a great little aphorism because if you remember, among other things, the madman runs to the people in the town square and tells them that that God is dead, but they're all atheists. So what
Hmm.
is he trying to warn them about? They don't believe that God exists anyway. But he also says, you don't understand what I'm telling you. God is dead and we've killed him. And they're like, yeah, of course God is dead. They don't understand they still believe in God. It's just they've given God a new name. Science, technology, this sort of thing, right?
And that's really prevalent too. It's like you see those signs that people sometimes put in front of their houses, and it says, "In this house, we believe in science."
That is the credo. That is the humanist liberal credo. Yeah, I mean that's
Mhm.
what it is. It's an affirmation of the points of your belief system, right? Yeah. Um, okay, so there's always, and if that's true, that um, the technology as a salvation myth is an article of faith, it's by definition irrational, right? So there's always something irrational about rationality, understood in this sort of sublimated form of, you know, the man god Elon Musk. I say man god because that's the term that's often used to refer to Christ as God becoming immanent in the world, right?
Hmm.
But you see the same kind of maybe subconscious elevation of, the tech bro as avatar on basically religious terms. And it's all based in this belief that, you know, um, technology will give us complete mastery over the world, will make us, in some sense, gods, right? And in fact, like, it's even the sort of thing where the ancient belief in the eternal soul has now become a research project. That is to say, uploading consciousness to the web or whatever, or right, this idea that you could digitize consciousness. Um, there is no evidence for that, and there are strong arguments against the possibility of that. Of course, those arguments also are not particularly good at giving a constructive analysis of what consciousness is. But the point is that there are pretty good arguments against the possibility of digitizing consciousness, and there's certainly no evidence that we can really do it. But people believe that it's going to come one day. It's their
If
Messiah.
you want to hear something very like almost tragic, I'll make this really brief. But a
Yeah.
friend of mine once told me that he's trying to be as healthy as possible because he wants to extend his lifespan to the extent that like he'll actually get to live to the time where they have the technology to be able to
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
And I was like,
It
oh,
used to, it used to be cryogenic freezing, right? So that,
all right.
yeah, so like they cut off your head and put it in a freezer. And then hopefully 3,000 years from now they'll be able to digitize it or something. I mean, that's mythology, that's faith, right? It's irrational. There is no, if you follow Locke and evidentialism and the idea that you should apportion your belief to the evidence, then it is completely irrational to believe in those sorts of things because there is no evidence that it's going to be possible, right? There may not be strong evidence that it's impossible, but you know, except for self-contradictions, tautological falsities, it's very hard to prove the impossibility of something, right? So there's very little evidence understood empirically. There's very little empirical evidence for the impossibility of anything, right? But certainly the belief in those things is a new form of religion. It's a new form of myth, right? And you can see it in many different expressions in the sort of technological world. But I want to get back to the main idea because I don't think myth is really the imminent outside that they're talking about.
Hmm.
There's something else. Give me a minute. I'm going to take a break for 2, 3 minutes, and you can do the same, talk amongst yourselves, or try to like comb through the text or anything. Once we establish this last little point, then one thing I said is it'd be good to maybe look at some individual sentences that you think are evocative or whatever, and try to unpack them. So, but let's come back in about 2 minutes, okay? 9:20. All right, great. Okay. So this imminent outside, the jail cell in Thoreau's terms, you're both in the system, and yet you got to find a place that is outside it, yet within. What does that mean? What's their solution? And there may be kind of two names that they give to this site of resistance. One is a historical name, and they don't think that that's really a live option. But there's a live option in society that has many of the same characteristics as the historical other to Enlightenment. Um, that is potentially a live option. So it's not myth, at least in this essay, because they're talking about myth is also sort of, a sort of nascent form of enlightenment. What else do they talk about? I'll see if I can find the page. I was just looking at it. I should just do a word search here.
Oh, is it
Start on
on
page 19, maybe.
I was a little bit
Uh,
further. I was on 27 where it says measures like those taken on Odysseus's ship.
yeah, well, let's get to Odysseus because that's like the big clarifying myth. Um, that where everything comes together in the episode with the sirens. That's also, as I said, the most famous part of this essay, I think. But let's first name the sites of resistance, or I should say maybe the historical other to Enlightenment. Um, look on page 19. I think is the first place they start developing this, right? Uh, or well, let's see, 19. Yeah, I think no. Well, this is strange. I don't understand what is, huh? Okay, I take it back because I did a word search, but it's giving me the pages out of order. I don't know why. Look at page seven. Page seven, which is page 28, I believe. Yeah, 28 of the PDF, page seven. There's a place where they're developing this idea. What do they talk about on page seven? Yeah.
I'm reading through oh sorry, go ahead,
No,
Justin.
no, go ahead. Go ahead. There's a word
Um
they
oh,
keep.
like you're looking for a particular word?
Well, it's like a domain of human thought, domain of human activity, domain of human spirituality, perhaps you might describe it as. But what's the main thing they're talking about?
Magic?
What?
Magic?
Exactly right. Magic.
Mm,
Magic is an other to enlightenment. Um, it's still a sort of heuristic, uh, tool of control, perhaps. It's a tool of control that is not about explanation, though. It's not about naming, right? It's not even really about expression. It's about this sort of, well, what is magic exactly? It is completely outside of the true false binarism. It's not true or false, right? It's somehow quite distinct from it. And in particular, they're talking about the relationship that magic has to the world that's different from reason. And they talk about it in terms of mimesis. Now, what does that mean exactly? Mimesis. How is mimesis? What is the relationship of mimesis to the world?
That it's uh, imitating things that exist in the material world, but it's not following the laws of logic that we normally ascribe to them.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. Yeah. So, they talk about dream logic, for instance. What do they say? At the magical stage, dream and image were not regarded as mere signs of things, but were linked to them by resemblance, right? So that, it's like what I was describing with musique concrète or something, right? That there's a sort of sympathy, right? Not understanding, not manipulation, but sympathy in mimesis, which is a different way of relating to the world. So there's another author from the same period. I don't remember when this book was written. I think it was in the 30s. Uh, who writes a lot about music. Her name is Susanna Langer. Um, and she talks about the relationship of like magic or ritual um, to say self-preservation as opposed to the way that reason accomplishes self-preservation. So reason is one way of interacting with the world in which in a certain point or in a certain sense, reason doesn't imitate the world. It just becomes the world. That is to say, I use reason to manipulate the actual atoms or the actual, chemical elements or whatever to accomplish the thing that I want, right? But mimesis is a little bit different. And so she talks about, my example here is what's the difference between, say, um, a rain dance as a magical ritual and say the sort of cloud seeding that the Chinese government performed for the 2008 Olympics to make sure it didn't rain on the opening ceremony. What is the relationship there, and what does it tell us about um, the aspect of domination, control versus sympathy? So one of the things she says is that, in a rain dance, it's not that the shaman is trying to control nature in the way that cloud seeding is literally controlling nature, right? Because of reason's ability to become nature, right? That is to say, to analyze the rational relationships that scientific analysis makes possible, and then reverse engineer that into a technology that we then use to control. Rather, what a shaman is doing is trying to become attuned to nature, um, but not through understanding it or controlling it, but simply by being sympathetic to it. And what that means is that if the shaman performs a rain dance and it fails to rain, it's simply that the shaman has not been sufficiently attuned or sufficiently sympathetic to the world, has somehow misread the world, but not because the world exists in a way that he doesn't understand, simply that he has somehow failed to get into a rhythm of life that is amenable to the rhythm of the world that he's trying to sympathize with, right? And so it's like this sort of, that's mimesis, really. Mimesis is this relationship to the world of, I can't think of a word better than sympathy, as opposed to control, right? And so, you might think that perhaps if you think that control, domination is either morally bad or is at least dangerous because of the fact that it can turn into self-control, control of others, domination, dehumanization, and so on, then perhaps mimesis is a better way to think about how we can interact with the world, at least to critique the shortcomings of enlightenment. Now, there's a big reason that they think that magic is really a non-starter today. For one thing, if we really were trying to just go back and become shamans or, live off the grid or whatever, or become, new age, uh, you know, um, um, you know, uh, perform the new age appropriation of native cultures or this kind of thing. That's not going to be a solution, right? And so what they say is you can't go back. There have been historical precedences, historical alternatives to rationality and control, namely the mimesis of magic, the sort of sympathy that a magical relationship to the world opens up. But magic is not the answer to the oppression of enlightenment, the shortcomings of enlightenment. But there is something in contemporary society, contemporary culture that is mimetic, just like magic, but might still have the seeds for a genuine critique of enlightenment because it's both in our society and yet doesn't play by the same rules as enlightenment. And what is that? Oh no. What's their solution? What is the thing that human beings can sort of respectably pursue in contemporary culture that is destabilizing to the rational technical order? And so therefore similar to magic, precisely because it's mimetic.
Oh, is it art?
Yeah, art.
Mm-mm.
Art, right? And so they see art as that site of resistance inside the system that's still outside of it because it's not about control, it's about mimesis, it's about some kind of sympathy, it's about not really being true or false, but simply rejecting the idea that all that exists is true or false, particularly in a material sense, right? Um, and again, it's important to understand that they're not saying that the solution to the world is for everybody just to become an artist, although maybe that would help a lot of things. Maybe not, I don't know. But it's more a matter of a place from which you can establish a legitimate critique that isn't beholden to the structures that enlightenment makes possible. Right. And so that's one of the maybe conflicts or contradictions or hypocrisies of this text because they aren't exactly creating a work of art. They are giving us a logical argument, essentially, a historical argument, a rational enlightenment argument, but the way they're doing it is not exactly the same way as, say, the logical positivists might do it. And that's where that paratactic style comes in. right? Um, Give me a second. I need to pause this and I'll be back. Sorry about that. I had an important call, but it's being taken care of now. Oh, Arshia took off. Okay. Well, I guess I hope he's feeling all right.
So is this a little bit like when we were talking about Kant with the aesthetics, the possibility for art to open up all of these kind of um, partial images of other worlds that are connected? Are they kind of, is that the soft point that they're trying to find their argument through?
I mean, that would be one aspect of it, right? This idea that I don't know if you heard what Justin just said, Arshia.
Yeah, yeah. I was listening. Sorry, I went to grab an
That would be one
emergency
part of
pack.
it, right? This idea of partial presentation. So Kant talks about the way that in an artwork, it it prompts much thought, but not exactly conceptual thought, right? It's much thought to which no concept is adequate, precisely because it's this web of partial presentations, to use his actual terminology, partial presentations, which is to say, ideas that are connected through associations, but the ideas are never like these concrete conceptual ideas or these closed off conceptual ideas. They're always partial and open, but then also because of their openness, are able to connect in a way that is not strictly conceptual or strictly inferential, where you are, um, uh, you know, asking whether phenomenon X meets the necessary and sufficient conditions for this concept, and if so, then what follows logically from an assertion that is based on this concept, et cetera. It's something a little bit different. Now, the other thing that they're saying that I think is drawn from Kant's aesthetics is this idea of the focus on the uniqueness or the individuality of actual experience. Because one of the things that concepts and reason always do is that they standardize. And standardization is one sort of societal way of describing it, or homogenization. But what that means is it's always about generality. Concepts always traffic in generality. Whenever I say, oh, I'm talking to two people right now, that's true. But notice that in calling you guys people, I am really reducing your individuality, really reducing the specification or the uniqueness of you. And for instance, if I say, something like, oh, I'm talking to, you know, privileged males in the English speaking world, and therefore I know a lot about their experience or their opinions about the world or something. I'm reducing a lot about your actual, experience, your own actual feelings about the world and your misgivings or your, other beliefs about the world and so on. And there's something unethical about that, right? And so art is interesting, aesthetics is interesting for Kant, and I suppose this is carried over into Horkheimer and Adorno because it always brings us back to the specific moment, the specific object, and not the object simply as an example of a concept, but no, this object now in my experience, right? And that might also be my own experience. Instead of thinking of my experience as simply a generic version of a concept that everybody's familiar with, it's to realize that there is this maybe nearly infinite dimension of my experience that's unique, that can't adequately fit under a concept, right? And that's something that aesthetic experience responds to. But it responds in a way that's interesting because, you know, it's also to a certain extent incomplete. There's an incompleteness to that, and that's where that idea of the web of aesthetic ideas or whatever comes in, right? So, yeah, I'd say that those things are to be found here. But, back to what I was saying before the interruption, art is this place in Enlightenment society, rational technical society, that is, it's part of our world, it's part of our society, but it doesn't exactly play by the same rules. And they try to capture some of art's potential in the way they make their arguments. And so this is kind of a hybrid work. It is philosophy, which is to say, it is, I suppose, asking, is X true? But it's doing so in a way that has at least one foot in the world of mimesis, in the world of parataxis and not logically consistent argument and so on, even though it is still an argument. Now, one way to think about mimesis and art and the alternative that it provides is right around page 25, which is where the Odysseus stuff with the sirens gets started. But there's a quote that I want to read first. Let me go to page 25 here. Okay. So they're talking about, enlightenment, domination, liberation through domination, but that means self-oppression, etc. Magic is in a mimetic relationship to the world, but it's also a past form of consciousness, and so not really a live option anymore. Even though there is this desire, perhaps, to go back to something before, society became all rationalized and standardized and all this kind of garbage, this longing for an imaginary past or something like that, right? But that's impossible. And then they're talking about the sirens. And one of the things that they say about the sirens is that, and it's important to remember that the episode with the sirens comes in the book after Odysseus goes to the land of the dead. So he goes to the underworld in book 11, and then in book 12, he's back in the world of the living and has to sail past the sirens. So they talk about how, Odysseus is emerging from the world of the dead, the world of the past, and so on, and that the sirens song, they make the claim, I don't remember exactly what they say, but they say something like, okay, I'll just start reading. It's something like, what Odysseus has left behind him, this is on page 25, what Odysseus has left behind him has passed into the world of shades. Literally, he just left the underworld. So close is the self to the primeval myth from whose embrace it has wrested itself that its own lived past becomes a mythical prehistory. It seeks to combat this by a fixed order of time. At a certain point, they say that the promise of the siren song is that you could recapture the past, but at the expense of the future. What that means is, to go back to this mythical, magical place. But if you do that, your ship will be destroyed and you'll die. There will be no future. That's their kind of mythical way of saying you can't go back. We want to go back to something before, we were working in factories or these 9-to-5 jobs, or where social media is totally colonizing our experience of our relationships and all this kind of stuff. But you can't go back. You got to find some seed of possibility, some seed of alternative in the past, but that is expressed in a live option. And then what they say is the following. The urge to rescue the past as something living, instead of using it as the material of progress, has been satisfied only in art, in which even history, as a representation of past life, is included. One way to kind of translate that is, progress sees history as dead. Art sees history as living. Well, what is history here? History is the alternative to the status quo as we find it, the rational technical society. History is magic, perhaps, right? And art contains the seeds, but it moves in a somewhat different direction. One way that you can see this is to think about um, technology or scientific explanation and its relationship to the past, treating it as dead, as just the material of progress. It helps us get to where we are, our most modern technological innovations or most modern scientific explanations, but it is itself dead, the past. What does that mean? That's the way that science and technology view the past alternative to enlightenment. What does it mean to say that it treats it as the dead material of progress? You don't even have to look at the text, just think about what that means.
That there's nothing in it for us to be interested in, that it's very goal directed.
Yeah, okay. There's a more straightforward way to think about it, and it has to do with the word obsolete.
Mm,
Does it make sense to talk about obsolete technology?
yeah.
Wait, you said yes, but you shook your head no, which
No,
is,
I was like, yes, it's like
oh,
it's
oh,
happening all
okay.
the
I thought
time.
you were being
Yeah.
super dialectical or something.
No.
Yeah, it sure does. What does it mean when technology is obsolete? What does that mean? How do
That
you?
it no longer satisfies like our needs.
Yeah, okay. It is not as efficient as it could be, or it is directed towards a goal that we no longer want, or something like that, right? What about a scientific explanation? Can a scientific explanation be obsolete?
Yes.
And what does that look like?
It is when it's maybe it got something wrong, or there was another version of it that was just simply better or more
Yeah,
capable.
so exactly. So here's the next question. Um, from the point of view of enlightenment, from the point of view that um, sees technological innovation as current or scientific explanations as current, outside of that particular moment, aren't every isn't every previous moment in the development of scientific explanation or the development of technology obsolete? The whole past is obsolete from the point of view of enlightenment as technology, enlightenment as rational scientific explanation. All of the past is obsolete. It's only the most current thing that is still viable, is still alive. Okay. Now I want to ask you the following question. Can art be obsolete? It would be hard to make the case that art is obsolete. Maybe you could say that, well, I don't know, it like came out of a time that is different from the time that we're in. But if it's a great work of art, that's irrelevant. It's like, is a Beethoven symphony obsolete? I mean, not really, because it isn't truth functional for one thing. It can't get it wrong. It's just a mimetic expression of what it's like to live in the world as a human subject or whatever. But just because it's mimetic, it's not true or false. It's expressive, but not an explanation, right? So that art has a different relationship to the past that treats it as living. And here's one way to look at it, from the point of view of scientific explanation. Um, Probably, let's see, Arshia, you took a philosophy of science class, right?
Yeah.
Did you talk at all about Aristotle in that class?
No, actually,
Probably
but
not. And
yeah,
the
no.
only time that you would talk about Aristotle in a philosophy of science class is probably just as an example of how wrong things can go,
Mm.
right? Um, so most of the time you won't even waste time on Aristotle's cosmology because he believes all these wild things like that planets have souls and that one of the planets is, or one of the fixed stars rather, is the unmoved mover, which is God and all that. What? That's not scientific. Understood as an artwork, though, it's incredibly beautiful and expressive and really interesting. So that gives you a little bit of the idea of the way that art treats the past as something living, as something viable. That's not about being true or false, not about being more efficient, but simply as a way to sort of express the aspirations or the wishes or the dimension of human freedom that can't simply be reduced to a quantitative analysis, a rationalized system, right? Let me give you another example. Okay. And this comes from the example of two different ways that we can talk about past technology. There's obsolete technology, but there's also vintage technology. What's going on in vintage technology? How are we encountering technology? Are we encountering it from the Enlightenment rational technical perspective, or is there a different perspective from which we appreciate the value of vintage technology?
We're appreciating it in an artistic or aesthetic sense.
Aesthetically, vintage technology means um, an awareness of technology as aesthetic, which is to say a different mode of engagement, a different mode of experience towards certainly the past and all the alternatives to rational, technical, administered society that are there in the past, but where the past is no longer a dead material magic, something we can't go back to, or if we try to go back to, just like Odysseus, will be destroyed on the rocks. But it nonetheless has some of those aspects of magic, but expressed in a way that is still viable in our society. That is to say, through art, through the aesthetic engagement with the world, right? And so that's their solution for the time being. It's the site of resistance from within Enlightenment society that nonetheless is outside it because it doesn't play by the same rules. It's mimetic, but not, dominating. It still has the seeds of magic, but in a way that sort of loses that element of control. There are some problems, however, with art as an alternative to rationality. And I think that if we analyze the episode with the sirens, we'll get some ideas of the limitations of art as a critical project set against enlightenment. What
Um,
yeah.
Sorry, I have a question before we go
Okay.
there. I was wondering, so I'm sure they're not saying that like everyone should become an artist and engage in art, but rather that to view life from an aesthetic perspective as well, right? So it's
Well,
like engaging with life
I think
in an
that what
aesthetic
they're
manner.
saying is that, and you have to sort of take for granted their materialist, post-Marxian viewpoints that religion, magic are non-starters. The belief in a transcendent world is a non-starter, right? I mean, religion continues on in our world. They have things to say about religion that suggest why they think that that's not really a viable option. Um, Mostly because religion is just enlightenment well, maybe I should say it this way. There are rational or, technological or explanatory approaches to religion, and then there are aesthetic approaches to religion. But the distinction is really back to aesthetics versus rationality, right? I mean, what I mean by that is you could be a young earth creationist and just believe as an article of faith that the world was created in 7 days and even try to find scientific evidence for that or whatever, or you could even maybe believe that's pretty extreme. I mean, you could even believe something like um, we have souls, and as long as we are believers, we will have immortality. That's a rational approach to religion. The reason I say it's a rational approach to religion is that you're trying to find an explanation that will get you out of your suffering. In other words, oh, even though I'm suffering now, we have souls, and souls are going to be the thing that help us escape from death, etc., right? But then you could also have an aesthetic approach to religion, which is something more like, religion is a particular way of expressing our awareness of our finitude, but our simultaneous awareness of the infinite. right? But not from the point of view of saying, oh yeah, I have an infinite soul and that's going to be my absolute self-preservation. Think about that. I mean, the afterlife is just a psychological move towards self-preservation,
Mm.
understood in that rational sense. But you could have the aesthetic sense of religion as sort of religious experience that you don't understand, that you don't seek to explain, but that somehow gives a deeper, more fulfilling dimension to your life or something like that, which would be aesthetic. But the point is that religion doesn't get you anywhere. What you come back to is aesthetics versus rationality, right? So, I guess what they're saying is, yeah, well, I don't know. To a certain extent, maybe they think that everybody should sort of become an artist. That doesn't mean that they become professional artists. You still need to have a society of doctors and I don't know, scientists and whatever. But to understand that the positivist rejection of aesthetics, the positivist elimination of value theory is actually shutting down at least half of human experience and pretending like there's nothing that's not worth pursuing, essentially. I mean, that's a somewhat strong indictment because, of course, the positivists don't believe that aesthetics, that there is no such thing as aesthetic experience. What they believe is that there's nothing that can be said about it, and so therefore you shouldn't talk about it. But the problem is that if you devote your life to the pursuit of one thing and say that there's nothing that can be said about this other domain of life, it's a fallacy, but it's still an easy move to make where you say, oh, that other side that you can't talk about doesn't really exist. Right. And it's just through social practices that the prohibition on, say, aesthetics or religion or whatever, metaphysics as a research project then establishes social practices, forms of life, wherein you treat that as something that just doesn't exist or just doesn't count or is not worth your time and just becomes forgotten. And as a forgotten entity, it sort of has the unofficial status of not existing. I hope it's clear what I'm saying. I mean, I'm trying to make it not too academic in the way I describe it, but it's just, you know, it's like saying, well, you can't prove um, you know, like I'm an atheist, for instance, and I say you can't prove God exists. That's not the same thing as saying God doesn't exist. But most atheists move from you can't prove God exists to God doesn't exist,
Mm.
right? And I think that that's what they're complaining about, this the shutting down of so much of human dignity that is not easily quantifiable, is not truth functional, is not about standardization, all these sorts of things that when you take Enlightenment as the only game in town, Enlightenment has no way of dealing with these things. And if you think that there's nothing outside of Enlightenment, then you're saying that those things don't actually exist. Those things aren't immanent in the world. They're just sort of, whatever, logical fallacies or nonsense or whatever. Okay, so but let's try to unpack the Odysseus myth with the sirens. Anybody want to summarize the myth? I hope you remember it well enough, because there are a lot of really important details in the story. Okay, so Odysseus,
It's
yeah,
I'm,
the
I'm sorry.
Odyssey. I'll just say a word or two about the Odyssey. There's some kind of interesting things about the Odyssey. What they want to claim is that you can read the Odyssey as a prototypical account of bourgeois subjectivity. One reason for that is that okay, Odysseus. Okay, so he's like a general in the Trojan War, and then as he is returning back to Ithaca, he gets lost at sea, mostly because he injures a Cyclops that happens to be the son of Poseidon, and then Poseidon makes his ship get lost for 10 years. Um, but one thing about Odysseus is that, okay, so one thing that Odysseus is known for, his great virtue, is his cunning. The Greek is his metis. It's a sort of reason that is really good at getting what he wants by tricking people, by using double entendres. He uses a double entendre to disguise his identity. When the Cyclops who he's injured says, "Who are you? Who did this to me, so that I may curse him to my father Poseidon?" Um, the first time Odysseus says, "Oh, my name is," I think it's something like Udeus instead of Odysseus. And Udeus literally in Greek means no one. So he's able to, dissimulate, maybe just through a cunning mispronunciation of his own name. Um, but one thing that's interesting is that his excellence, from the point of view of Kantian or Christian morality, is actually a vice. It is his cunning, that he's a really good liar. Well, Odysseus is the avatar for instrumental rationality, not about, the search in a Socratic sense for the good. It's all pre-Socratic. It's rather the good understood as being a really excellent liar and getting what you want because of how well you can deceive people, right? So that's one thing. He shared a lot with Donald Trump, for instance, right? Okay, so that's one reason that they think that he's a prototypical kind of bourgeois Enlightenment individual, that he is par excellence a virtuoso in instrumental reason. There are a lot of other things that are kind of interesting. So, like, actually, the island of the Cyclopses, when they go there, um, uh, one of the reasons that they go and, kind of plunder the livestock, I think they're like eating all the sheep on the island or whatever. The reason that they go there is that the Cyclopses are just kind of natural beings. They're just these, I guess, monsters that don't really have a society. They're just kind of barbaric savages or something. And the specific rationale that he goes for going to the island and essentially colonizing it is that they're just living off the land. They're not cultivating the island. And that's exactly the rationale of things like manifest destiny, things like eminent domain, when a corporation or a university or whatever takes over an urban neighborhood because they say that it's not being properly cultivated. The Native Americans weren't cultivating the land, and so therefore it's the right of, say, the enlightened white people to colonize them and so on, right? Another thing about Odysseus is that he goes around and names everything. On his voyages, he starts to give names to all the islands, and it's sort of the origin myth of a lot of the different identities in Greek society, that they were named by Odysseus, and so that's also supposed to be an Enlightenment, um, a facet that is shared with Enlightenment, right? This idea of identifying, naming, analyzing, providing the necessary and sufficient conditions, etc., right? Now, the story of the sirens is really interesting, particularly because of the role of art or magic or whatever, this primeval alternative to instrumental rationality. Because what happens is that they know that they're going to be passing the sirens. I think they're warned so there's a goddess or demi-goddess named Circe who falls in love with Odysseus, but he kind of tricks her and leaves her in the lurch after they, make love or whatever. But she warns him about the sirens. I think that's one of the things that happens earlier. So they know that they're going to be passing this island where there are these beautiful monsters that sing this irresistible song. And if they hear the song, then they will be drawn to the rocky cliffs where the sirens are, and their ship will be destroyed and they'll all drown. So Odysseus's solution to that is to tell his crew to keep rowing as hard as they can, but he stuffs beeswax in their ears so they can't hear the song. All they can do is focus on work, getting the ship past. But Odysseus, because he's the commander, he's the manager, right? He's like the CEO of the ship. He doesn't have to row. And so what he decides to do is he wants to hear the magic, the magical song of the sirens, but he knows that if he does that, that he'll probably like jump off the ship and, try to swim over there and drown. And so he has his men tie him to the mast and says, no matter what you see me doing, if you see me screaming that I want to be released, whatever, don't untie me. But he doesn't have wax in his ear, so he can hear the song, but he's immobilized. His crew has mobility, they're rowing, but they can't hear the song. Okay. How is this an analysis of the place of art in rational technical society?
Well, the sirens represent the past, right? So uh, Odysseus is uh, he's drawn irresistibly to want to recreate a non-viable past, whereas the rational technical society that's represented by the rowers don't engage at all with art.
Yeah.
Is that I feel like there's a final point there that I was building to, and
Yeah.
then it totally makes
You're
sense.
you're really close to the analysis, right? So one of the things about this is that if it's true that art as a viable expression of mimesis as opposed to magic, which is inviable, but if art is a viable alternative to rational technical society, and as such, it destabilizes the interests of rational technical society, the interests of capitalism, right? For instance. So, I mean, what I mean by that is simply that the sort of art that we create, for instance, right? Or the sort of art that isn't really interested in just making a lot of money, um, is a value that's inconsistent with capitalism, right? If the world were really organized around, say, avant-garde art, I don't think capitalism would exist. I think that the sort of value that we might get out of non-commodifiable art is not economic, right? Or at least it's not capitalist, right? It's not really rational. It's maybe some other deeper kind of quasi-spiritual thing or something, but it's an affront to the values of enlightenment. It's an affront to the values of capital, right? That's what it means to say it's destabilizing. Okay. So you can see the ship as essentially a microcosm of a capitalist society, of an enlightenment, rational, technical society. And art is this object of desire. People, you ask why do people, despite how hard it is to make a living, why do people go to study art? What does it give them? If it doesn't give them material comfort, if it doesn't give them money, if it doesn't give them all the values that they're supposed to want in an enlightenment society, why do they do it? I don't know. Maybe from the point of view of enlightenment, there's even something self-destructive about pursuing art. That's why your parents always say, "Oh God, are you really going to study art? Why don't you study engineering or something?" Right? There's something really destructive about art. It's destructive from the point of view of the values of enlightenment. It's not necessarily inherently self-destructive or anything like that. It's just that the values of art are in a front are destabilizing to the values of enlightenment. But the point is that we're all stuck on this ship. America in the year 2024, right? Whatever, capitalism. But the desire for an alternative is still there. However, because that desire is so destructive to the ship, there are really limited ways that we can engage with it. Either we can't engage with it at all, in which case we're the working class, in which case we don't have time for, or maybe precisely because we don't have time for, we have no knowledge of and therefore no interest in art, but only because we have been forced to ignore it as a viable alternative to our 9 to 5 rowing jobs or whatever. Then you have this other element of society, the managerial class, that is still able to a certain extent pursue or appreciate things like art or things like, you might think of art as more capacious than just painting or music or whatever. You might think of art as humanistic study, right? Studying philosophy, not because it can help you get a job, but just because it's a pursuit of the good life or something. They are able to encounter it, but only if they totally quarantine themselves from its power. That's what it means for Odysseus to tie himself to the mast. You can appreciate art provided that you treat it as completely powerless to affect capitalist society. So the way we see that, I think most obviously, is this whole conversation about whether or not people should get college degrees in America in 2024. And the wealthy, the Republicans generally, and the people that they've duped, I guess the rowers, the people in their trucks with the Trump flags or whatever, all want to say that, education, college degree is a waste of time, a waste of money. It's not going to help you get a job. And in fact, probably you'll get a better job if you don't go to college. And yet at the same time, the wealthiest class are always going to liberal arts colleges. And even if they're studying business, they still read all the great works of literature. They still go to museums and get that kind of education, but not to become artists. So that they realize that as the managerial class, as the privileged class, they at the very least can hear the siren song of an alternative to the dehumanizing, quantified workaday world, but not so much that they actually pursue it, that they actually give their lives over to it. And that's really the only place that art can have in a capitalist society, in a rational technical society. It's this alternative to the status quo, but just maybe I could say it this way. As a true alternative, it must necessarily be cut off from the status quo, because if it's even minimally commodifiable, it's no longer an alternative. It'll just be absorbed back into the system. So to be a real alternative, it's always going to be cut off from the Enlightenment system. But it still is there as this hope, right? And I talked last time about utopia as having the same kind of structure where it's like, so utopia is an idea of reason that for various reasons, if you try to accomplish through instrumental rationality, the only rationality left to us in Enlightenment society, you'll end up destroying the world, hence communism, hence fascism, all these various sorts of utopian social projects that ultimately fail. Art has the same kind of status, right? It's this alternative, but the pursuit of it is destructive to the system and the people in it, right? And it's this sort of impossible wish, but it's still a wish, it's still a desire. The last thing I'll say, which is probably a good introduction to maybe the next thing we should read, the culture industry essay, is that in addition to art and mimesis being simultaneously an alternative, but also cut off from Enlightenment society. By the way, I should say the structure of mimesis is the same sort of thing. Mimesis is not in this kind of relationship where you control the phenomenon. Rather, it's always in a sort of metaphorical, disconnected relationship to it. The imitation is never actually integrated with the thing it's imitating. It's always set apart from it, right? But in addition to that limitation of art as a viable option, art becomes colonized by Enlightenment rationality in the culture industry. So that what we come to mean by art as a viable human pursuit, as the sort of thing that won't just lead you to poverty or self-destruction or whatever, is always basically commercialized art, right? And as commercialized, it's no longer about aesthetic experience. It's about the maximization of distribution, the maximization of, maybe material pleasure, having a beat that will help you exercise or whatever, right? But that's all separate from the aesthetic content of art. It's art simply as a rationalized commodity that enables you to control people, essentially. And that could mean through, either the culture industry, but then also propaganda. Propaganda is art instrumentalized, right? It's aesthetics, but with the sole purpose of persuading people to fall in line with what you want them to believe. And their major claim is simply that there is no real distinction between propaganda and the culture industry. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. If you want, we could spend a minute or two if there's certain sentences or whatever that you either didn't understand or you thought were evocative of something and you want to unpack. You have any of those? Or do you have any questions as regards to the last bit of stuff I said?
I don't have any questions. Let me look through quickly through what I've picked out just to see if there's anything that stands out.
Do you have anything, Justin?
No, don't have
There's so
anything.
many good lines in this. It's sad. I wish you would have highlighted. Haven't you highlighted anything?
One of the ones that I have is on page 19. I
Okay.
can share my screen if you'd like, if it
Yeah,
makes
yeah,
it
maybe that
easier.
would be good. I'll enable that.
Hmm.
Sure. All right, go ahead.
So here it is. It says mathematical procedure became a kind of ritual of thought, despite its axiomatic self-limitation. It installed itself as necessary and objective. Mathematics made thought into a thing, a tool, to use its own term. Um,
Yeah.
and I guess like that's a lot more clear to me now, given all the things that we just talked about. But what is its axiomatic self-limitation?
Axiomatic self-limitation. I think its axiomatic self-limitation is the idea that thought as calculation, and I think they use the word calculation in this essay. I think that's maybe the more kind of umbrella term, right? That mathematical or the mathematization of thought is to um, consider thought as nothing more than calculation, right? And so in the case of mathematical calculation, I think it's self-limiting is simply the idea that math understood as the expression of rationality holds that there is no thought that is not just calculation. So thought becomes limited to nothing but calculation,
Oh, okay.
right?
Okay.
And so calculation means quantification, which means fungibility. Is that something that's clear? That word fungibility, what that means? You know what
Uh,
fungibility means, Justin?
Like reproducibility.
Yeah, basically reproducibility or equivalency, right?
mm,
So one thing that they want to say is that an axiom, one thing that's axiomatic about mathematics is that any mathematical assertion, proposition, formula, whatever, has as an axiom the equivalency of terms, right? And what they want to say is that in aesthetics, it's possible to perhaps come to an awareness and an appreciation of the non-equivalency of the objects of experience. In other words, the
mm,
uniqueness, right? The actual specific non-abstract individuality of this thing in my experience, right? Or even of my own experience, right? And so mathematics limits itself from that. Mathematics can't exist without the assumption of equivalency of terms, which means mathematics can never really approach the uniqueness of aesthetics because it's always going to be abstract. It's always going to assume equivalency, right? Um, so, I would say that that's a big part of it. Another way to think about equivalency and universality, right, as something that's maybe kind of oppressive, you could think about it in the following way. So, for one thing, No equivalency. Sorry, I'll say this again with no sneezes. No equivalency, no universality.
Hmm.
Why is equivalency a necessary condition for universality?
Because you need to treat everything as the same in order to be able to generalize them.
Exactly right. If I call you people or students, what I'm saying is, despite your differences, actually you're equivalent. You're both instances of the concept student, right? Okay, so equivalency brings us to universality. Now, what's oppressive about universality, right? One way that I like to do this, I used to teach a class, actually, you're probably in the class, or you took the class, but not with me, Music 303. I talk about this kind of stuff in relation to
Mm.
serialism, right? And this idea of system as an expression of universality, that if you have a system that is organized around whatever the conditions are, such that you call it a system, what do you do with respect to things that don't fit in the system? You either minimize them by saying they're irrelevant to the system, or you try to incorporate them in some way into the system. But one thing they say is that I think they say enlightenment, rationality, equivalency, etc., universality amputates the incommensurable. I think that's a sentence. It amputates the incommensurable. In other words, it cuts it off. It says it doesn't matter. It says it's impossible. So if I'm writing a serial piece where everything is integrally connected based on some universal structure that organizes everything, it means that I can't do anything in the piece that is spontaneous or arbitrary and still have it fit the system. And if my evaluation of the piece as good requires that it be systematic and coherent and consistent, then it means I'm really cutting off my expressive freedom, right? What I say is like, okay, so you got, Webern's symphony where like it's insane how organized the thing is around a simple uh, um, symmetrical structure that organizes register, pitch, timbre, rhythm, all this kind of stuff. But and it's thoroughly organic, it's thoroughly unified, it's thoroughly consistent, it's thoroughly systematic. But that means if Abram wants to have a cymbal crash, then there's nothing that he can do because it doesn't fit the system, right? And so therefore it would be bad if that's the metric you're taking for that. But from a social point of view, anything that doesn't fit the concept must be cut off from the concept. So, for instance, if you have a society that is rationalized in the following way, everybody is either a consumer or a producer, and that's all that really counts. That's what it means to have an identity. You have an identity through your work, or you have an identity through the cultural commodities you consume, but there's nothing else. It's not to say that people don't have other experiences that aren't characterizable in those ways. It's just that from the point of view of the system, they don't count. It cuts them off, right? So that universality, in order to have universality, in order to have that, you have to have this element of equivalency. And anything that's not equivalent, anything that's incommensurable, you get told that's just make believe. That's not a real way to live in the world, or you're actually wrong and should be exterminated in the gas chamber, or something like that, right? I mean, but that's all from the structure of generalization and equivalency, such that anything that doesn't fit under that must be excluded from society, from life, from rational argument, etc. So that's really the oppression of universality. It means standardization. It means the amputation or the destruction of those unique aspects of our lives, of our personhood that can't be adequately contained in a concept. And it's only through aesthetic experience and basically Kantian model that we can kind of access that. I would say, however, that aesthetic experience is probably for Horkheimer and Adorno a little bit broader than just the awareness of beauty in nature or in artworks. I think that aesthetic experience could be a way of encountering your own life and your values and that kind of thing, with this emphasis on the uniqueness of your own experience, right? And to realize that everybody has that, everybody wants that, but the Enlightenment system cuts that off. And then in the culture industry essay, one of the things they say is it doesn't totally cut it off. What the culture industry does is give you a false version of uniqueness. They call it pseudo individuality. And what they mean by that is, as an example, the idea that cultural commodities, even though they're all pretty standardized and pretty industrialized, your standard pop song, every one of them is right around 4 minutes long, that has the same structure, same basic chord progression, it's always the same four chords in the same order, same instrumentation, same rise and fall of form, verse, verse, chorus, verse, bridge, whatever, and then, and yet, when you look at the marketing, it's always about this sort of radical individuality, of the personalities of the singers, or the, way that people try to chisel out their identity by being fans of a musical group or a sports team or something like this. But that's all fake uniqueness, fake individuality. It's individuality simply as a marketing slogan, and not as an actual unique and non-quantifiable, non-rationalizable dimension of experience. So, that desire for giving voice to your own experience becomes commodified in this false version of individuality as branding in the culture industry. So it comes back, but in this oppressive way in that essay. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's probably a good stop, unless there are so many good lines in the first essay. So maybe, we probably won't meet for a couple of weeks, because I'd want you to read the culture industry essay, and it's about 40 some pages, I think. So, we could meet in, what, you want to meet in 2 or 3 weeks? How long you need for that essay?
Let's see, 2 weeks from now would be, is that Thanksgiving or like the week of
Well, if we
Thanksgiving?
meet on Mondays, then Thanksgiving's irrelevant.
Oh, well, no, the only thing is that I'm coming back on
Oh, you'll
Monday
be busy
after
that weekend. Oh,
Thanksgiving.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, I'm visiting family.
2 weeks would be the week of Thanksgiving, right? So the Monday before Thanksgiving.
So it'd be the 25th, right?
We could do it then. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that works well for me if that works well for you, Justin.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that works. Yeah, and actually next week I will be out of town on
Okay.
that Monday morning. So
Okay. So 2 weeks from now, you both should be around for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, the thing that's nice about the culture industry essay is that there's lots and lots of actually mostly terrible secondary sources on it. Like, if you ever see a podcast about Adorno, they're always talking
Oh
about
God.
the essay. What I would say is, as you're reading it, it's not hard to think of counterexamples, and it's not hard to think of objections. You'll get the most out of the essay if you, one, really understand the dialectical nature of the argument, because it's very easy to read it and say, oh, these are two dead old white German men that just didn't like what the young kids were doing or whatever. And it's easy to just dismiss it. I think some evidence against that reading is the fact that Adorno spent like 8 hours a day sometimes watching TV. He and his wife Gertrude were famous for like being like very knowledgeable about the most current TV series and everything in the 50s and 60s, And actually, even in the culture industry essay, he doesn't come down hard on all popular culture. There are certain things that he likes, like he really likes Betty Boop. He hates Mickey Mouse and likes Betty Boop. Why? Weirdly enough, he doesn't talk about Looney Tunes, but I am completely sure that 1940s Looney Tunes would be totally up his alley. He would love that. So then the question is, okay, so it's not that he just hates all popular culture and he wants to return to, Mahler and, whoever, or Second Viennese School kind of stuff. He does things at Second Viennese School precisely because of how much it resists commodification. Is probably the most viable approach. He likes Beckett quite a lot. Beckett was quite popular in the middle of the century. So the point is try to read with him first and not against him because it's easy to read against him. It's harder to really get what he's after because it's not the simple sort of argument that high culture good, popular culture bad, right? It's that there are certain approaches to culture in high or low forms or whatever that are more or less liberating, are more or less oppressive, right? And then to really think about what is the engine of oppression? What is it about certain ways of formulating artworks or advertising for artworks or whatever that is oppressive? And what's liberating about the alternatives? I don't know. It's a long essay and there's a lot of examples. I always often use it. And one time I got in trouble because I had a hardcore Zionist in one of my classes, and I was trying to take a light touch with Adorno because he seems very serious most of the time. And I was describing how in critiquing conspiracies, he himself starts to sound almost like he's a conspiracy theorist. And I said that one of the examples of that is how wide-ranging the argument is, such that he talks about Donald Duck and Auschwitz in the same sentence. And this Zionist student, not having done the reading and not realizing that Adorno is like one of the major Jewish intellectuals, although he had a really fraught relationship to Judaism, but is one of the major, critics of anti-Semitism in the 20th century, was like, you know, um, basically attempting to get me fired, I think. She stopped short of that, but once I sort of explained what was going on. But the thing is that it's a really complicated argument, and it's easy if you hear him saying Mickey Mouse bad to then immediately assume, oh, he only likes Wagner and Schoenberg. That's not right. Right? It's easy to assume that the negation just means the affirmation of its opposite, but that's not right. Okay, so that's what I'll leave you with, I guess. We'll come back in 2 weeks, and it's same sort of thing. Try to sketch out what is the structure of the argument, how does it relate to the claims of the first essay, and then we'll talk about specific examples, both of 1940s culture, and then maybe talk about an updated version that incorporates things like social media or whatever. Okay.
Hmm.
Yeah. All
Yeah.
right.
Thank you so much.
Great. Okay. Yeah. I will see
Take
you
care.
next time.
All right. Bye-bye.